There are stories that begin with a plate of food, but end with stifled screams and a secret that no one should discover. Clara, a young and hard-working cook, accepted a job at an isolated ranch, the kind that seems to be taken from a period drama. But the reality inside was even darker than any fiction. Between silent walls and unsmiling eyes, she felt the price of naivety firsthand. How often does the promise of stability hide something dangerous? How many Claras are there out there, saying yes to the chance to work, without realizing that they are entering a territory where survival requires courage and freedom may depend on reporting? Maybe you know someone like this. Maybe you yourself have kept quiet out of fear. But what if we told you that even in the scariest scenarios, there is room for transformation? That from the kitchen of terror, a community kitchen can be born, which feeds not only the body but also the soul of those who have lost almost everything. What would you do if you discovered that the ranch of your dreams was, in fact, a field of horrors? This story is about courage, escape, denunciation, but it is also about rebirth, justice, and female empowerment. Stay until the end, because you will understand how Clara went from being a victim of a criminal network to becoming a reference for overcoming. And the most surprising thing? One of the ranch owners had a secret that would change everything. Clara was one of those people who turned leftovers into feasts. She grew up hearing praise for her magic skills in the kitchen, but like many talented people out there, she was run over by reality. Unemployment, late rent, and a fridge screaming empty. When a job offer came up as a cook on an isolated ranch, she hesitated, but hunger and desperation don't ask for permission. The deal was housing, a steady salary, and unlimited food. Who would refuse? With her suitcase on her back and a heavy heart, Clara set off towards the unknown. Arriving there, everything seemed at first glance almost poetic. A place surrounded by forest with wooden sheds, horses roaming freely, and a bucolic atmosphere that reminded one of farm stories. But the ranch was too big for so few people, only men, and everyone seemed tense, as if they were always waiting for something or someone. Seuzeka, the foreman, was direct, almost curt, but he said proudly that the place worked like clockwork. Pedro, younger and kinder, was the only one who really smiled. Otavio, however, barely spoke, and when he did, his tone was always commanding. In the first few days, Clara realized that something wasn't right there. Doors that locked themselves, windows with bars on the inside, and a silence that covered everything like a thick, uncomfortable blanket. The kitchen was well equipped, but far from the main house, and although she was free to prepare meals, she couldn't go beyond certain points. Whenever she tried to make conversation, the men responded evasively or changed the subject. The feeling was clear. She shouldn't be there, or at least she shouldn't know too much. Even so, Clara tried to convince herself that she was overreacting. She was grateful for the chance and needed the money. But there were piercing looks, doors that only opened at night, trucks that arrived at dawn. There was a tension in the air that not even the smell of food could disguise. Little by little, the ranch that seemed like a refuge became a prison, and she, a pawn, without knowing the game in which she was being used. Over the next few days, Clara began to notice details she had previously ignored. The windows in the barracks had bars on the outside, not on the inside, as would be common in isolated areas. The locks on the doors were not on the side of those who wanted to protect themselves, but on the outside, as if those inside were supposed to be contained. This made her feel something strange in her stomach, that pang we feel when our body perceives danger before our mind formulates the right words. And even though she tried to stay strong, the feeling of being trapped grew with each new detail. Otavio was the most enigmatic of them all. His steps made no noise, and his eyes always seemed to be a second ahead of the others. He didn't talk much, but when he passed Clara, he would give her looks that mixed surveillance with a disconcerting kind of authority, as if to say, without saying it, "I know more than you think." She began to avoid him, but it was difficult. He would appear at the most unlikely moments, almost like a shadow, and each appearance of his reinforced the impression that she was not just a cook there. Pedro, on the other hand, became one of the few anchors of sanity in that environment. He was lighter, asked questions about his previous life, spoke of his childhood in a melancholic tone, disconnected from the place. Still, even he seemed to be hiding something. One time, Clara asked what they did there, besides raising livestock. He hesitated, said that the ranch took care of other things too, and changed the subject. It was at that moment that she realized everyone there was entangled in some way, in something bigger, something dark, something that no one dared to name. The routine was strict, set schedules, absolute silence after a certain time at night, trucks arriving and leaving without her being able to see what they were bringing or taking. There were no women besides her. And the warehouses in the back seemed to have their own rules, always guarded and locked. Everything seemed to work according to its own logic, where each person played a role and no one asked questions. Clara, even without knowing it, was already starting to ask the right questions. And those who start asking questions, sooner or later, discover what they shouldn't. Clara quickly learned that, on that ranch, survival required silence and wide-open eyes. But the truth has a curious way of revealing itself when it finds someone with courage. And Clara, although frightened, decided not to ignore the signs. She began to write down small details, the times when the trucks arrived, who disappeared for hours, and which doors were locked even in broad daylight. She hid the papers among the packages of flour and the false bottom of a drawer. Each note was an attempt to make sense of the absurd. One night, when she heard a noise coming from the shed in the back, Clara hid behind the wall of the outdoor kitchen and watched. She saw Pedro arguing in low voices with Otavio and Sauzeca. One of them said, "The next batch has already arrived," and the other replied, "The border is guarded, we have to wait for the next breach." This wasn't about cattle. It wasn't about food. It was about people. People like her, perhaps more vulnerable, who didn't even have a chance to choose. Illegal immigrants, women, children, she didn't know yet, but she knew, at that moment, that something was deeply wrong. Days later, taking advantage of a distraction, Clara snuck into the warehouse, a place she had never set foot in before. Inside, among poorly stacked boxes and plastic bags full of groceries, there were documents with names, nationalities, and ages. Many of them were very young. She also found some personal belongings, necklaces, toys, women's clothing. The ranch wasn't just a farm, it was a support base for a criminal network linked to human trafficking. This cut Clara like a knife. The ground seemed to disappear beneath her feet. With shaking hands, she left the place and ran to her room. She knew she couldn't trust anyone, maybe not even Pedro. But something inside her changed that night. She was no longer just a cook trying to pay the bills. She was a woman with information too dangerous to simply continue cooking. Now she had to choose between fear and courage, and the choice would have to be made quickly, because those who discover secrets like that don't usually stay quiet for long. The escape plan was not elaborate. It was instinctive, almost savage. After discovering the truth, Clara knew that time was against her. She tried to act normally for 2 more days, but Otavio seemed to sense tension. The conversations between the men became shorter, the looks more direct. One night, she was called to the warehouse, and the tone was too cold to be just about food. When she saw Sauzeca lock the door behind her, her heart raced. She made up an excuse, feigned severe pain, asked to go to the bathroom. That was when she found Pedro, as if fate had extended a hand to her. Pedro hesitated when he heard her, but something in his eyes showed that he hadn't slept peacefully for a long time either. Clara was direct. "I know what's going on here. If you don't help me, they'll wipe me out like they did with the others." He was shaking. He murmured that he had been thinking about running away, that it had been wrong from the start, but he had never had the courage. And in that moment, an invisible bond was formed. Their survival was linked to each other. In a few minutes, they had gathered the essentials: some documents, a cell phone hidden from Pedro, and food for the road. The exit would be through the back, along a trail that led to the highway, but they hadn't counted on the dogs. The barking tore through the silence of the early morning like sirens. Lights flashed and voices began to shout. Pedro pushed Clara along the trail as he tried to lose his pursuers. A shot rang out behind them. Another. Clara felt the wind of a projectile passing too close, but running was all they could do. Dense woods, mud up to their knees, branches that scratched their faces and their chests racing at an insane pace. Finally, they saw lights, headlights, a truck. Clara threw herself in front. The driver slammed on the brakes. She screamed, "Help! It's urgent! It's human trafficking!" The truck driver, a man with a rough appearance but a fair heart, quickly understood the gravity of what he had heard. He called the police, took Clara and Pedro in, and stayed with them until dawn. When the officers arrived, she handed over everything: documents, reports, the route of the trucks, the names. The complaint was formalized, and from then on, Clara would no longer be seen as a cook, but as the woman who had the courage to break the silence of a ranch that, for years, kept horrors hidden under the smell of fresh food. Clara's complaint did not fall on deaf ears. Within a few days, the operation was set up. Helicopters flew over the ranch, police cars guarded the entrances, and the news finally gave a name to what was happening there: a criminal human trafficking ring disguised as a model farm. Otavio, Seu Zeca, and others were arrested. Pedro, for collaborating, received police protection, and Clara, she became a symbol of resistance, not because she did something heroic, according to her, but because she did not remain silent when most would have bowed their heads. The repercussions were huge. Human rights organizations sought out Clara to give statements, participate in interviews, and even share her story at conferences. But none of this made her proud. What she really wanted was to help those who had not yet managed to escape. That is why, when she received support from an NGO, she decided to found one. Community Kitchen in a peripheral neighborhood, a place where many illegal immigrants, victims of violence and people forgotten by society, gathered for a plate of food and an attentive ear. The kitchen, more than just food, served as a shelter of dignity. There, women had a voice. They spoke about their pain, but also about their dreams. Clara organized conversation circles, taught recipes, talked about safety, independence, and how small gestures, like being suspicious of promises that are too good, can save a life. It was her way of giving back to the world the courage that she herself had almost lost. And there was no shortage of volunteers, people who said, "I saw your story and it reminded me of me." Clara understood that justice wasn't just about seeing criminals arrested. Justice was about preventing the network from rebuilding itself with new names. It was about breaking the cycle, planting education, female empowerment, and information in the same places where, before, there was only fear. She became a bridge between pain and personal transformation. Because sometimes it's in the kitchen, and not in a courtroom, that the real revolution begins. And Clara knew. Every pot she stirred now was a response to the violence that tried to silence her. Time passed, but Clara was never the same again. The woman who once fled through the woods amid gunfire now walked firmly through the city streets with her head held high and a clear purpose in her heart. The community kitchen prospered, and with it, the reach of her message. Clara began to be invited to give lectures in schools, shelters, and even prisons. She spoke about survival, courage, and mainly about the power of personal transformation. It said, "It doesn't matter what they did to you. It matters what you do with what they did." During one of these meetings, she met Ana, a Haitian girl who had crossed borders in search of a better life. Ana did not speak Portuguese fluently, but her pain was universal. She had been deceived by false promises of employment, just like Clara. The two embraced in silence. From then on, Clara began to receive more illegal immigrants in their kitchen. There, they were not numbers or statistics. They were people with names, stories, and most importantly, the right to start over. Clara also wrote her memoirs, a simple, sincere book called The Ranch and I. In the final chapter, she describes the night she burned the last letter left by Ottavio, a written request for forgiveness from prison. It symbolized the end of a cycle. She no longer wanted to carry the shadow of what she had lived. She wanted her voice to echo where it had once been, silence. And by putting his words on paper, he found healing and offered hope to others. Today, Clara is seen as a leader, but she still calls herself a cook. She says that the seasoning she uses most now is solidarity, because you learned in practice that to empower is to feed, that to resist is to serve, and that to denounce, many times, is the first step to building something much greater than the pain. Your story is not about a tragic end. It is about resilience, and perhaps about how even the worst paths can lead to destinations that change the world around us. What about you? What would you do if you discovered that behind a locked door, there are people waiting for someone with the courage to act? Clara's story shows us that salvation does not always come from the strong, but from the attentive, the sensitive, those who refuse to pretend they didn't see it. Sometimes, all a life needs to change is for someone to choose to do the right thing, even when they are afraid. How many similar stories are still hidden out there, waiting for someone like you to tell them? Maybe you've been through something similar. Maybe you know someone who needs to hear these words today. What can you do, starting now, with what you've just felt? If this story touched you in any way, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel to continue following stories that inspire, move, and make us reflect on the world and on ourselves. Oh, and comment below. What city or country are you watching us from? And more. Did this story remind you of any real situation you've seen or experienced? Let's continue this conversation in the comments. Your voice can inspire others too.